Hello QEP instructors, and welcome back to our QEP instructors training video series. Our last video was a review of everything we've learned so far about writing to learn. In this video, we'll go on to a new topic, but first let me point out that you now have everything you need to finalize your plans for your writing to learn activities in your QEP class. So when you come to our training on Saturday, April 26th, please bring all the information about the Writing to Learn activity or activities that you've decided on. We've said many times now that these Writing to Learn activities will produce 1,250 words, or half the writing required in your QEP class. Now it is time to move on to the second type of writing that will produce the other 1,250 words, process writing. So first, how is process writing different from writing to learn? Remember, writing to learn is a way to get your students to think critically about your subject matter. Another way to think of this is that writing to learn writing is a means to an end and not the end in itself. With process writing, however, you do want all that thinking to lead to a finished, well-written product. So, we said that a writing to learn assignment would be pretty short, but the finished product of a process writing assignment will be longer. Writing to learn is done right there on the spot. Process writing is planned. No outsider reads writing to learn writing, only the student and the instructor, but the final paper written using process writing is written for a real or imagined reading public. And writing to learn is informal, unedited, minimally graded, and a one-time deal. But the process writing paper is well crafted, edited, graded, and revised several times. Finally, we're talking about the kind of academic writing that most teachers mean when we talk about student writing. Writing that results in a finished product that is both polished and made public. This is also what our students mean when they talk about writing, but unfortunately, they settle too soon upon the finished product part of it, and they don't spend nearly enough time in the process part of it. Too often, they sit down and type something out the night before an assignment is due, and they think they've got this when what they've really got is this. Our biggest challenge is to get them to postpone the idea that they're finished and realize that they produce their best writing when they take the time to go through all the steps of process writing. These steps are actually based on the process that writers go through in real life. Only at the end of these steps do we have what we would consider a finished product. Think about it. If you have an important piece of writing to do, you probably don't sit down, dash it out, and send it off. No, first you think seriously about why you are writing and to whom. You jot down ideas, list all the points you want to make, and organize those points before you actually start writing your first draft. Then you let somebody else read what you've written. A friend, a coworker, a spouse. You tell them, okay, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Does this do what I'm trying to accomplish? And then you listen to what they say. And maybe of all the people you ask, there's one or two who just don't get what you're trying to do. So you ignore their feedback. But the other people may give you good advice. So then you go to make changes to your piece. Depending on how important that piece of writing is, you may go back for more feedback, revise again, get more feedback, revise again, any number of times until you are satisfied with what your piece says. Then, and only then, you'll turn your attention to grammar, punctuation, spelling, and other editing concerns. Sure, if you happen to notice these things before, you would have corrected them. But it's here that you really zero in on sentence level changes. Then, finally, you proofread your piece to make sure you haven't overlooked any mistakes. Now, One reason student writing is sometimes not very good is that students don't really have anything to say, especially in a discipline whose discourse they are just entering. To counteract that, we need to coax them into spending a lot more time on this step. But here's some good news. If you plan your writing to learn activities carefully, they become most of this first step. That is, the writing your students do in their writing to learn activities generates the ideas that they can explore further in formal papers. There's another place where writing to learn philosophy and process writing philosophy reinforce each other. Remember when we talked about writing to learn and how it should count in your class and be assessed, but not really be corrected? Bean calls this minimal error marking, and he recommends that we take this approach early in the process because it gives you a chance to make suggestions that will help students really revise. This is truly important, so let me say it again. To get better writing from our students, we need them to spend more time cycling through these steps. In particular, they need to do this. But the quality of their revisions depends almost entirely on the quality of feedback they get. Here is a more accurate representation of this feedback revision cycle. Ideally, students get feedback from 3 places: you, their peers in the classroom, and peer consultants in the Writing Center. We will talk about these other 2 responders later, but right now we are focusing on the feedback that you give students to foster effective revision. And we come back to that same principle we discussed in connection to writing to learn. For as long as possible, don't be a grader. Our Elements books gives us 4 reasons for this. The main one is that commenting on the paper as a whole makes for better student revision. In part, that's because when you start out grading, your comments tend to be justifications of the grade. Furthermore, reading and commenting is way more interesting for you. And finally, when you rush to grade, you send students a message that they are already entirely too familiar with, that the grade is all that matters. I would add a 5th reason to that as well. When students get a paper with corrections marked, they believe you've made an implicit deal with them. If you make these corrections, you will have an A. As Bean points out, once you quit giving them all the corrections they need to make, they gradually assume responsibility for their finished product. So if you're going to postpone acting as the grader, what role do you play? That of responder. Our textbooks give us 4 kinds of comments that effective responders can make. First, you can ask questions that stimulate thought. This puts the student back into the ideas phase of process writing, where she can modify or reconsider the strength of her ideas. Second, you can summarize briefly what you got out of reading the paper. This encourages the student to consider whether his writing is saying what he intends it to say. You can also give a description of difficulties you encountered while reading. I've heard many of you say something along these lines. Sure, I can try to postpone marking grammatical errors, but what about the students whose grammar is so poor that I can't really make sense of what they're saying? Well, here is where you'd want to point that out. You might say something like this: it seems as though you have some really good ideas here, but I'm having trouble understanding them because you can't write in complete sentences. Please come talk to me about setting up regular sessions in the Writing Center to work on this. It is what you need to do to pass this class. And finally, you can even give them highly critical feedback as long as it is constructive, respectful, and mitigated. Let's stop a minute and look at the verbs we used in that last slide. When you are a responder rather than a grader, you question, summarize, describe, respond, and critique. Do these verbs ring a bell? These are types of critical thinking that we encourage our students to do in writing to learn assignments. So when you respond to your students writing in this way, you are modeling for them actions of a strong reader and critical thinker. Another way to think about this is through the first 5 steps, you are dealing with higher order concerns. In the last 2 steps, you are dealing with lower order concerns. Does the term lower order concerns mean that these things are not important? No, not at all. It's just that when you deal with them too soon, while students are still exploring ideas and revising, you can create writer's block, switch on the internal censor, and waste both your students' time and your own time. Okay, so now I'd like you to read pages 21 through 24 in your Elements book, the section called Knowledge and Inquiry, 2 Models of Scholarship and Teaching. The authors describe here a traditional model that they call the knowledge model, and then a second model, the one they support, which they call an inquiry model. After you've read pages 21 through 24, write 3 or 4 sentences explaining how our QEP fosters the second model of teaching. Then go on to read Chapter 3 of the Elements book. I've already given you a general introduction to most of the points in this chapter during this video. So as you read, try to move from your general understanding of process writing to specifics. What specific suggestions in this chapter are you going to adopt? When and how? How does what you're reading relate to your own experience? Make these notes in the margin so that we can jump right into specifics in our next training session. Here are some examples of what I mean. On page 51, the authors describe 3 types of graders. Which of these did you encounter most often as a student? Which of these most closely describes you as a grader now? What will you do differently based on this new information? On pages 54 through 47, the authors lay out steps you can go through in responding to student writing. For each paragraph in this section, make a note in the margin that indicates your reaction to this suggestion and how likely you are to try it. On pages 58 through 60, the authors give 5 general principles for using your grading time wisely and 8 more specific principles. Choose 6 of these to talk about in our next training day. 3 that you would really like and 3 that you don't find helpful or don't understand. Finally, the authors give suggestions on how to elicit responses from students about their papers. Which of these might you adopt? So, that's it for this video. Next time, we'll discuss what you need to do and what you need to know to design your process writing assignment.